How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Rensch. This is Chess.com's YouTube channel, and today I am back for another opening lecture, continuing our journey to hopefully give you a quick, short video lesson on every major mainline weapon. We've already done a lot in our chess openings playlist. You can check them out. And so today, right now, what I'd like to do is cover an opening that's a personal favorite of mine, considering that it's a weapon that I use from the black side. We're going to look at it from the white perspective, because generally when you're trying to learn opening principles, especially if we're taking this sort of bigger picture perspective, it doesn't really matter what point of view you're looking at it from. And if you're one of these players who really struggles looking at an opening from the opposite side, then simply work on that instead of always having to flip the board. Try to see the concepts for what they are, rather than feeling like you need to have a bias in terms of your perspective toward the opening. That's just a little general piece of advice, instead of complaining about not being able to flip the board. So anyway, just kidding, but let's do this. The Nimzo Indian starts with 1 d4. It is a queen's pawn game, and of course there are many openings in both the queen's pawn and the king's pawn, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're going to get right to the Nimzo itself. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight to c3, and bishop to b4. The general idea for black in the Nimzo Indian is a dynamic one. It's a dynamic approach. What do I mean by that? Well, there's positions that are static equality, meaning the structure is exactly the same. Generally, both sides have the same types of minor pieces. There's not really an imbalance. And they're all different types of important philosophies and strategies for playing static equality or static structures that are sort of locked. And then there's dynamic games like a Nimzo Indian, for example, where the general idea for black is to give up the bishop for this knight, giving white the powerful bishop pair, which is indeed a weapon. Don't kid yourself. The bishop pair, as most positions do, eventually become open and dynamic. Giving it up so early is always a risk on a general level. For example, the Zamish a3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3 is a classical line of the Nimzo, where black is giving up the bishop early and doing so willingly. What is black getting in compensation for these two powerful bishops and potentially very strong center for white, if he can ever expand it? Black is getting the ability to target these doubled pawns for the rest of the game. It's a huge positional disadvantage. These are not the type of double pawns that are going to undo themselves. As long as black doesn't make a sort of positional blunder with a move like d5, letting them undouble, the more standard approach in the Nimzo is to take, double the pawns, and then play c5, either here or even after castles. What you're seeing here is a position where black is locking these pawns down. And after a few more natural moves, e3, castles, bishop develops, black develops a knight, white develops, b6, castles, bishop a6, we see black's developing plan is actually very straightforward. He played b6 to bring the bishop here. He brought the knight here in order to put it here, where both of these pieces you see are now barreling down on this weakness. And the fact that he's extended the c5 pawn has locked these guys in and potentially prepared the open way for the c-file. If the rook comes to c8, we capture on d4. This pawn is a big-time problem. What white generally does in a line like this, and this is something that really highlights, as I said, the difference between static and dynamic play, where white has this horrible weakness, but his compensation is one with the bishop pair in the center. White plays e4. You see, it's a dynamic game, meaning it's roughly equal, but both sides are playing for completely different things. Black with this sort of goal to keep the position semi-closed, target white's positional weaknesses, and develop all of his pieces with those goals in mind. And my apologies for that. Black is keeping all those positional goals in mind, but he must be very wary of white's pieces coming potentially toward the king side, as the bishop pair is a very dangerous tool if you're trying to attack the king. The best move here for black in this line is a move like knight to e8, simply preventing the pin with bishop g5 and taking away some of the power of this advance of e5. After which black typically continues with f4, and there are two ways to approach it. Black can immediately play knight a5, rook c8, at some point maybe even consider bringing this knight to d6, but that is usually overkill as white can't really defend the pawn anyway, and doesn't really want to. White would rather use his time to attack the king. So black can move forward with that and intend to meet f5 with the move f6, trying to slow down the pawn storm. Or black can play the more modern and more accurate move, f5. If anybody remembers, I reviewed one of my favorite games from the Nimzo Indian, Geller Uwe from Zurich International 1953, and highly recommended the Zurich International 1953 book by Braunstein. But f5 is the more modern approach The idea for black is to continue to maintain an effort to keep it sort of semi-closed, putting a clamp on this f4 pawn, which in turn prevents real activity from this bishop. The theory here is dynamic, though this line is considered to be generally good for black at the highest level these days. But I wanted to start with this line first when giving you a general outlook of the Nimzo, as it highlights the imbalances. One point would be if knight a5, f5, just to show you the power of the attack. Let's say black just ignores white's attack and continues to move ahead. This will just show you the imbalance that white doesn't really care that much about the queen side if he can establish things like this. f6 is a brilliant move, prying open the king here. Obviously, pawn takes would be pretty ugly and pretty risky, and probably pieces will continue to come over here in a number of different fashions. And black will find his king in big trouble. But even the other move, knight takes f6, wouldn't really help at this point. As I'd achieve my goal of pinning, I'm threatening e5, threatening to double your pawns along the f-file and open up your king at the same time. And we see these are the kind of issues black can deal with if he doesn't take the appropriate measures, like either f6 in this position before taking the pawn, as the game Geller Uwe Zurich International 1953 showed. Again, you can find that game in our classic chess games, Sweet Chess Games playlist here. Or the more modern approach by black, which is considered the best, which is f5. Back to the beginning positions of the Nimzo, I will say that the other major way for white to play, other than going for variations that have this sort of imbalance of the double pawns, is the classical variation of the Nimzo. After queen to c2, black has several moves. He can play b6, he can play c5, he can play d5, and he can play castles. It's debatable, actually, which one is best, and so instead of reviewing it a whole bunch, as these video lectures are just designed to give you sort of a general outlook and kind of we'll consider it a kickstart, right, into getting your knowledge of this opening started. And there are more main full-length featured lectures on our website, Chess.com. Of course, you can go there and subscribe to that, but otherwise you can use this as just sort of a general guideline and use other information you can find to help you. So the queen c2 idea is pretty clear. White is wasting a little bit of time with the queen with the idea of avoiding the double pawns. So let's say after the standard move like castles, white might play a3, and after chop-alicious, we have a new kind of imbalance, an imbalanced position where white has the bishop pair and doesn't have these horrible positional weaknesses. You might think, wow, this looks like the best way for white to play. But of course, the disadvantage is that you've lost some significant time. Black can play several moves here, including knight e4, d5, b6, and even c5. All these moves are completely playable for black, and you get a struggle where white has the bishop pair, and so a long-term advantage if he can develop the king side and get both bishops activated. But he's lost some time, and so the dynamic play continues from there. Other variations that can occur from the Nimzo Indian. After bishop to b4, we can also see e3 right away. And if a3 is played, we'll have transposed, is a term used in the opening when you've reached the same position through a different move order. You can transpose into the line I first showed you in the Zamish, or you can see moves like knight g to e2 here. Again, with an idea kind of like the classical to avoid double pawns, but what are we doing once again? We're sort of blocking our own development. So even if black plays something like d5, a3, and retreats the bishop, we'll see that it's a perfectly playable position, more of a static structure where neither side has given up too much. White's avoided the positional weaknesses on the queen side, but has also blocked in the development of this king side bishop. Finally, another way to play is a very standard move, knight f3, very natural developing move. Again, c5 is the Huebner variation. Roman Zinjihashvili has some great video lectures on that on our main site. b6 is playable. It's a move order that I play, more like a Queen's Indian setup, which is another opening lecture we're going to have here for you in our Chess Openings playlist on YouTube very, very shortly. And even castles. Again, if a3 is played, this is usually a mistake for white because now white has the same positional weaknesses, but the knight on f3 is not as good as it was in the first line I showed you. You can back up and see the video again, because you'll notice that in the other position the knight was on e2, which sort of allowed these f-pawns and e-pawns to roll quickly. A lot of people don't know that small little idiosyncrasy, that typically trying to play this way with the knight on f3 can be a devastating error against an advanced player who knows what he's doing. So instead, after castles, there's moves like bishop to g5. There's also moves like e3. Here, if they take here again, they can try to get that structure, but if white hasn't wasted this tempo, the position is still more imbalanced. And so with that said, I would say that those are the main ways for white to play. With, again, to review, white can play the classical, avoiding double pawns, but taking the risk of losing time with the queen. He can play the Zamish and the very sharp classical positions where white gets this bishop pair and big center imbalance and dynamic compensation for his horrible weaknesses. Then there is e3, which is a flexible move. Again, you can play a move like a3 and transpose. You can play moves like knight ge2. You can also play moves like bishop d3 and then knight g2, I forgot to mention, after which in this position black has options of both c5 and d5. And you can also play the moves with knight f3, which sometimes has the idea of a bishop g5 development. Sometimes you play e3 and transpose into similar structures. You just have to avoid playing a3 in a lot of positions, as that loss of time can be critical. Okay, well, thanks everybody for checking out this video lecture on our Chess Openings playlist on the Nimzo Indian. This has been Daniel Rensch with another video lecture, and we're going to see you around on Chess.com. Hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you around on Chess.com.